around the 17th and 18th centuries, mainly through missionaries and cultural exchange. But during the 20th century, Chinese musicians began asking an important question. Can the violin speak Chinese? In other words, can a Western instrument express the musical language, aesthetics, and philosophy of Chinese tradition? One of the most important figures in this exploration is the violinist, composer, and educator Yang Baozhi, who devoted his career to what he called the nationalization of the violin. In this lecture, I'll discuss two of his violin arrangements. Ambush, based on the famous pipa piece, Ambush from 10 Sides. Ode to Guangling, based on the ancient Guqing composition, Guangling San. These two works represent two completely different sound worlds. One is dramatic, violent, and percussive. The other is philosophical, meditative, and tragic. In addition to historical background, I'll focus on one key performance issue, glissando, and how it functions differently when imitating the pipa versus the guqing. Before we discuss the piece, we need to understand the musician behind them. Yang Baozhi was born in Guangdong in 1935 into a musical family. His mother studied piano in Shanghai, and his father was a classmate of Xinhao, composer of the Yellow River Cantata. Interestingly, Yang Baozhi did not begin as a violinist. He started as a pianist. In 1949, he watched a film about Niccolò Paganini and another documentary about Carnegie Hall. In that film, he saw Yehudi Menuhin performing the Violin Concerto in D major by Tchaikovsky. That moment changed his life. He decided to switch to violin. However, he started relatively late and felt he could not compete with students who had trained longer. So he focused on composition and entered the Central Conservatory of China of Music in 1952, where he studied with Ma Sicong. A key turning point came during two performances. At one point, he performed The Swan by Saint-Saëns in a factory concert. The audience listened politely, but the reaction was rather lukewarm. Later, during another performance at a railway construction site, he played an arrangement of a Chinese opera melody from The White-Haired Girl. This time, the response from the workers was overwhelming. The contrast led him to realize that the violin could communicate more deeply with Chinese audiences when it expressed Chinese musical language. In 1956, he arranged the Dizi piece, Happy Reunion, and the arrangement achieved great success on stage. He combined the tone color of the violin with the melody, preserving the original Chinese style while also adding a contemporary touch, mainly through the use of unique bowing techniques and changes in tone color. Happy Reunion became the first Chinese violin composition adapted from a traditional Chinese instrument piece after the founding of the People's Republic of China. And it has since remained a must-learn Chinese composition for every violin student following the Cultural Revolution. He later spent 30 years in Sichuan and Chongqing, performing not only Western instruments, but also many Chinese instruments, including banhu, zhonghu, suona, and percussion. This experience gave him a deep understanding of traditional instrumental timbres, which he later translated into violin technique. In 1983, Yang Baozhi went to the Shanghai Conservatory of Music to pursue further studies in composition. At the age of 48, he was the oldest student in the class, and he cherished this rare and valuable opportunity deeply. He systematically studied professional courses such as counterpoint, fugue writing, and an introduction to traditional Chinese instrumental music, and also audited classes in musical form and choral conducting. During that time period, he arranged 3 refrains at Yuan Pass for viola, which later became a compulsory repertoire for national viola competitions. Looking back on that experience, Yang Baozhi recalled with deep emotion. The advanced study was the most important lesson of my life, and it gave my compositional skills a fundamental leap forward. Entering the new century, Yang Baozhi's works for a nationalized violin have gradually been promoted in other countries, allowing audiences worldwide to experience Chinese culture through the sound of the violin. To better understand ambush, we need to go back more than 2,000 years to one of the most dramatic military conflicts in Chinese history, the Battle of Gaixia. This battle took place at the end of the Chu-Han contention, a power struggle that followed the collapse of the Qing dynasty. After the Qing Empire fell, 2 major leaders emerged. Xiang Yu, a brilliant military commander known for his physical strength and battlefield courage. Liu Bang, who was politically strategic and eventually became the founding emperor of the Han dynasty. Xiang Yu was widely admired as a heroic warrior. He won many early battles and was considered almost invincible. However, he had one major weakness. He was more skilled as a fighter than as a strategist. Liu Bang, on the other hand, relied heavily on advisors and developed long-term military plans. By the time of the Battle of Gaixia, Liu Bang's forces had gradually surrounded Xiang Yu's army. According to historical accounts, Liu Bang's troops did not rely only on military force. They also used psychological warfare. At night, Liu Bang's soldiers began singing songs from the state of Chu, Xiang Yu's homeland. When Xiang Yu's troops heard these familiar songs coming from all directions, they believed that their homeland had already fallen and that they were completely cut off. This destroyed their morale. This moment is one of the most famous scenes in Chinese historical literature. It is often called the Songs of Chu on all sides. Realizing that he had lost, Xiang Yu attempted to break through the encirclement, but failed. According to legend, he retreated to Wu River. His beloved concubine Yu performed a farewell dance for him, and then he took his own life. Because of this story, Xiang Yu became a symbol of tragic heroism in Chinese culture, a brave warrior who was defeated not by lack of strength, but by a strategic and psychological disadvantage. The encirclement of his army in this battle also gave rise to the famous 4-character idiom, ambush from 10 sides. This story later inspired a famous pipa composition that bears the same title, with anonymous authorship. The piece was passed down orally through generations of pipa players and gradually took shape and became standardized during the Ming-Qing period. The earliest known written pipa score of it dates to 1818. Unlike many Western programmatic works that focus on a single emotional trajectory, this piece functions almost like a musical narrative or a battle documentary. It does not simply express war in a general sense. Instead, it presents a sequence of specific scenes: the preparation of the armies, the ambush, cavalry attacks, hand-to-hand combat, the final defeat, and the sound of troops withdrawing. Traditional pipa players use highly detailed techniques to imitate battlefield sounds: rapid tremolo to represent drums, percussive string strikes to imitate weapons, sudden dynamic contrasts to depict surprise attacks, and rhythmic acceleration to suggest cavalry charges. In Yang Baozhi's violin arrangement, the piece follows the same narrative structure as the original pipa composition, presenting a sequence of scenes from the battlefield. We can think of it almost like a cinematic narrative. The first section represents the formation of the camps. At this point, the two armies have not yet begun fighting. Instead, they're facing each other across the battlefield. The music here is tense and spacious. Wide intervals, strong rhythmic gestures, and sustained tones create a sense of anticipation, as if both sides are waiting for the first move. The next section is the ambush itself. Here, the texture becomes more fragmented and rhythmically unstable. Sudden dynamic contrasts and irregular accents suggest surprise attacks coming from multiple directions. After that, we hear the skirmishes. Smaller, fast-moving clashes between groups of soldiers. The music becomes more virtuosic, with rapid passage work and sharp articulations that suggest quick exchanges of blows. This leads into the Great Battle, which is the climactic section of the piece. Here, the texture becomes extremely dense and energetic. Multiple layers of sound create the impression of a large-scale conflict, with soldiers shouting, weapons colliding, and horses charging across the battlefield. Finally, the withdrawal section depicts the end of the battle. The energy gradually dissipates, and the music becomes more spacious again, suggesting the sound of troops retreating and distant war signals fading away. To translate the original pipa techniques into violin language, Yang Baozhi uses a wide range of extended violin techniques. For example, ricochet bowing imitates the rapid tremolo of the pipa, which is used to represent the continuous beating of war drums. When you hear this rapid bouncing bow, you can imagine the rhythmic drive of the battlefield. Double stops create a dense, multi-layered texture that suggests the presence of many soldiers at once, rather than a single melodic line. They are also used to imitate distant war horns or conch shells, which in ancient China were used as military signals. Harmonics create a quiet and tense atmosphere during the ambush. Finally, various percussive effects on the violin, including left-hand pizzicato and strong accented bold strokes, imitate the sounds of drums, swords, and other weapons. When Yang Baozhi arranged this piece for violin, he was not simply transcribing notes. He was translating an entire sound world from one instrument and one historical imagination into another. So when we perform ambush on the violin, we're not only playing virtuosic passages, we're recreating a historical narrative that Chinese audiences have recognized for centuries. It is also important to understand that Ambush is not only about violence. For Chinese listeners, the story of Shang Yu carries deep emotional meaning. Admiration for his bravery, sympathy for his tragic fate, and reflection on the role of strategy versus heroism. So even in the most brilliant and virtuosic passages, there is an underlying sense of tragedy, because we already know how the story ends. This duality, spectacular battle scenes combined with a tragic historical outcome, is one of the most important expressive elements performers must convey. Now, I'd like to turn to the second work on today's program, Ode to Guangling. To understand this piece, we need to look at both history and cultural mythology, because the meaning of the music comes from several different layers of tradition. The story is most commonly associated with the historical figure, Nie Zheng, who lived during the Warring States period. According to the historical text, records of the Grand Historian, Nie Zheng was asked to carry out an assassination for a political patron. At first, he refused, because he needed to care for his elderly mother. Only after his mother died did he accept the mission. After successfully completing the assassination, he did something extraordinary. He disfigured his own face and took his own life, so that no one could identify him and implicate the person who had supported him. Later, his sister came to the marketplace, identified his body, and publicly revealed his identity so that his honor would not be lost. After doing so, she died in grief. Because of this story, Nie Zheng became a symbol of loyalty, filial piety, and personal sacrifice. However, the version of the story that is most closely connected to Ode to Guangling is not the strictly historical one. In later folklore and musical tradition, the story was transformed. In these versions, Nie Zheng assassinates a tyrannical ruler as an act of moral justice, sometimes to avenge his father. So the music is not simply about an assassination. It is about righteous resistance against oppression. The second, and perhaps most important layer of meaning, comes from the scholar and musician, Ji Kang. Ji Kang was a philosopher, poet, and guqin player who lived in the 3rd century. He was known for his independent thinking and his criticism of political corruption. Eventually, he was sentenced to death. According to tradition, before his execution, he requested to play the guqin one final time. He performed Ode to Guangling. And when he finished, he said that the piece would disappear with him. Whether this actually happened or not, the story became extremely influential. From that point on, Ode to Guangling was no longer just a piece of music. It became a symbol of intellectual freedom, moral integrity, and resistance against tyranny. After that, Ode to Guangling has been almost disappeared. Later, in 1425, the score of it was collected in the earliest repertoire of traditional Chinese music. The author mentioned that the score of Ode to Guangling was treasured in the imperial courts of the Sui, Tang, and Song dynasties, and was thus passed down through the generations. It is also important to understand the role of the guqin in Chinese culture. The guqin was not a public concert instrument. It was played by scholars in private settings, often alone or with close friends. It was associated with self-cultivation, philosophy, poetry, and introspection. So when we perform Ode to Guangling on the violin, we're not only presenting a historical narrative, we are entering the inner world of the scholar. This is very different from the outward dramatic energy of ambush. If ambush is a depiction of external conflict, Ode to Guangling represents internal struggle. Ode to Guangling is a traditional guqin piece, also with anonymous authorship. It is one of the most famous 10 guqin pieces in China. After generations of musicians' arrangements, the whole original piece has 45 sections. In Yang Baozhi's violin arrangement, only several sections are selected, creating a condensed narrative. We can hear a calm, reflective introduction, like a storyteller recalling ancient events, the preparation for the assassination, the act itself, the mourning of Nie Zheng's sister, and finally, the image of Ji Kang facing execution. The piece ends with harmonics that fade into silence, suggesting that these events dissolve into the long river of history. I'll now play a short excerpt from the opening section. As you listen, please notice the flexible rhythm, the subtle use of glissando, and the restrained tone color. These elements reflect the meditative character of the guqin and the introspective nature of the scholar tradition. In this excerpt, the emotional intensity is internal rather than external. The sound is not meant to be dramatic or virtuosic in a Western sense. Instead, it emphasizes resonance, silence, and gradual transformation of tone color. This brings us to one of the most important technical questions in both works. How glissando functions as a cultural and expressive device. In Chinese musical tradition, vocal music, such as folk songs and Chinese opera, has had a strong influence on instrumental music. At the same time, the structure of the Chinese language also shapes the way vocal music is performed. Unlike English, Chinese is a tonal language. Most Chinese characters consist of a single syllable, and their meaning depends on the tone. Because of this, pitch movement in Chinese music often functions differently from that in European music. Musicologist Shen Cha points out that tonal registers are one of the key features that distinguish traditional Han Chinese music from European musical systems. In general, European musical lines tend to move in a relatively linear way, focusing on stable pitches. In contrast, Chinese musical lines are often more curved and flexible, with subtle inflections that shape the musical expression. These differences contribute to the distinct aesthetic approaches found in Eastern and Western musical traditions. A tonal register refers to the way a sound changes over time, including changes in pitch, dynamics, and timbre. When performing Chinese violin repertoire, we often think that we are imitating the sounds of traditional instruments, such as the erhu, guqin, or pipa. However, at a deeper level, what we are imitating is not only the instrument themselves, but also the prosodic features of the Chinese language. Traditional Chinese string instruments such as the guqin, pipa, and erhu have developed a wide range of techniques to express these tonal inflections. These are produced not only through left-hand techniques, such as fingering, but also through right-hand techniques, such as bowing and plucking. When adapting these musical ideas to the violin, one of the most important techniques is glissando, which is smooth slide between pitches produced by the left hand. Glissando is produced when the violinist slides the left-hand finger along the string from one pitch to another, allowing the intermediate pitches to be heard. The bow remains on the string so that the sliding motion is clearly audible. From a musical and aesthetic perspective, glissando in Chinese compositions can vary depending on the region, the musical style, the instrument, and even the specific character of the piece. Within a single work, different types of glissandi can convey different moods. For example, changing the speed of the slide can alter the emotional intensity, while changing the direction of the slide can create different tonal colors. However, despite these expressive possibilities, glissando is ultimately still a technical issue for performers. Glissando can be categorized in several different ways. First, according to the direction of the slide, we can have upward and downward glissando. Second, according to the range of the slide, there are narrow glissando, usually within the minor third, and wide glissando, which cover a larger interval. Third, glissandi can also differ in speed, so we may hear either fast or slow slides. They can also vary depending on the fingering. For example, whether the slide is produced with the same finger or with different fingers. Another distinction is whether the slide involves a change of position or remains within a single position. Finally, from the perspective of tonal structure, glissandi can also be classified as upper structural tone glissandi or lower structural tone glissandi, depending on whether the structural tone lies above or below the starting pitch. In addition, some glissandi are closely connected with other ornaments, such as trios, grace notes, or wide vibrato. It is also important to note that expressive glissando is not produced by the left hand alone. The bow plays an equally important role. Bow speed, pressure, contact point, and bow placement all influence the dynamic shape and timbre of the slide, allowing the glissando to sound expressive rather than mechanical. A useful analogy is Chinese calligraphy. Although the outline of a character remains the same, the variation in each brush stroke, its speed, pressure, and direction gives the character its vitality. Let's now look at several examples from Ambush and Ode to Guangling to see how glissandi can be executed and how appropriate fingerings can be chosen. First of all, it is important to understand that glissandi in ambush and ode to Guangling should be expressed differently, because they are derived from works originally written for different instruments. Ambush is based on a pipa composition, while ode to Guangling comes from a guqin piece. Although both the pipa and the guqin are plucked instruments, differences in their construction lead to very different approaches to glissando. The pipa has raised frets and relatively short, tight strings, whereas the guqin has no frets, resulting in longer and softer strings. Because of this, the strings of the pipa vibrate for a shorter duration than those of the guqin. As a result, glissandi on the pipa tend to sound bright, percussive, and rhythmically articulated, while glissandi on the guqin are usually softer, more subtle, and more meditative. Now, let's look at two examples from both works to see how glissandi can be performed on the violin and how we can choose the most efficient fingering. One typical example can be found in measure 54 of ambush. This is exactly how the publisher notated the passage in the score, without any indication of fingering or bowing. However, it is evident that performers cannot execute it in this manner. Let me explain the steps behind this decision and how we determine where to place the glissando. The first step is to play this passage back into its broader musical context. In this way, we can better understand its character and expressive mood. If we look at the score, we can see the marking, largamento before measure 54 and ascellendo afterward. This suggests that measure 54 functions as the broadest and most expansive moment within this section. In addition, the markings at lip and ritardando following the accellendo indicate a transitional gesture leading into the next section, which is marked adagio. In other words, this passage begins to hint at the character of the following section, ambush. Within this context, measure 53 and 54 serve as the first indication of that transition. After understanding this context, the next step is to look at how this measures differs from the surrounding ones. Within this passage, many melodic and rhythmic patterns are repeated, except in measure 53 and 54. This contrast suggests that a change of character should occur at this point. Glissando is one of the most effective ways to highlight the contrast between measure 53 and 54 and the surrounding material. However, it cannot be used arbitrarily. So the next step is to determine where the glissando should be placed. Since measure 54 forms the second half of the phrase, measure 53 and 54 need to be considered together. If we look at the melodic contour of the entire phrase, the climax occurs on D3, on the downbeat of the second beat. This note functions as both the melodic focal point and the structural tone. The G2 cannot serve as the focal point because it acts both as the ending of the first half of the phrase and the beginning of the second half. Therefore, in order to emphasize the structural tone, the glissando should be placed immediately before D3. Based on this analysis, the The glissando here can be considered an upper structural tone glissando, since the starting note A2 is a perfect fourth below D3. In this type of glissando, the slide moves toward the structural tone and then away from it. With this understanding, now we have the structure of this measure. The fourth step is to determine the bowing and fingering. As mentioned earlier, the downbeat of measure 54, G2, functions both as the ending of measure 53 and the beginning of measure 54. So the following notes, A2, D3, and B2, can be understood as a glissando group. Therefore, the downbeat G2 and the glissando group should be treated separately. Under the marking legamentals, the glissando group can be played in a single bow. In contrast, the 30-second notes should be played with separate bows. In Chinese music, upbeat 30-second notes often serve as an accent and can signal a sudden change in musical character. Now let's look at the fingering. Using a same finger glissando helps enhance the sliding effect and makes the contrast with the surrounding passages more striking. For this reason, I suggest using the second finger. The first finger is not suitable because D3 would have to be played in 6th position, which is unnecessary. The fourth finger is also not practical, since A2 cannot be played with the fourth finger on the E string. If we consider measure 54 alone, using the third finger would not create any technical difficulty, and the glissando could begin in 1st position. However, once we take measure 53 into account, the situation changes. The C3 sharp on the last beat of measure 53 should be played in 2nd position rather than using an extended fingering in 1st position. There are 2 reasons for this. First, using an extended 4th finger for this ornamental C3 sharp would be impractical. The note value is very short, and the interval between C3 sharp and the following B is a major second, which makes the intonation less secure. Second, although C3 sharp is written as an ornament, it is also the first note of a descending melodic line, and therefore needs to be slightly emphasized. Using an extended fingering for an emphasized note would not be appropriate. For these reasons, the second half of measure 53 should be played in 2nd position. Continuing this position into the first beat of measure 54 naturally leads to performing the glissando group with the 2nd finger. In Ode to Guangling, we can also find several passages that use upper structural tone glissando. One example is the Andantino rubato section. The composer marks a slower tempo here compared to the previous section, together with the longer note values and the slurs. This suggests a calm and steady musical character. Because of this section is particularly suitable for using glissando more extensively. As discussed in the previous paragraph, glissandi on the guqin are typically soft, subtle, and meditative, mainly because of the instrument's long strings and the absence of frets. In guqin music, both upper and lower structural tone glissandi are common, often combined with a narrow sliding motion. The performer plucks the string only once and then pushes or pulls it to change the pitch. As a result, the sound gradually fades during the glissando. With this in mind, we can now think about how the glissandi in this section should be performed. The table here shows the two main types used here, and this gives an example of how this passage should be interpreted. The dynamic markings not only indicate a gradual increase in volume, but also suggest a growing emotional intensity. Based on this, we can divide this passage into these three phrases. The first two phrases begin with E1 and end on the same note. The climaxes of the first two phrases are both C2, while the third phrase reaches E2, which is higher. At the same time, the rhythm becomes increasingly tighter. The final note of the first phrase is longer than that of the second, suggesting a shorter breath between the musical sentences. Imagine that something is troubling you and you want to confide in a friend. You hesitate twice, each time stopping yourself and holding your feelings back. On the third attempt, however, the emotion finally reaches its peak, and you are able to speak. Similarly, in this passage, the gradual buildup of emotion within the same musical material can be expressed in several ways, such as changing the strings, adjusting the fingering, or emphasizing the glissando. The first phrase has the calmest emotional character, so I use a normal fingering from the D string to the A string, and then back to the D string. In the last measure, there are two identical notes. I treat the second note as an echo of the first, so I play it on the G string. The glissando in this phrase should not be too slow or too emphasized, because two more phrases are still to come. To allow the emotion to build gradually, I change the string in the second phrase. The B1 can be played on the D string in a higher position to increase the intensity, and then moved to the G string to create a deeper sound. As in the first phrase, I treat the final note as an echo, so I place it on the D string to create a different timbre. The glissando should not be too slow or overly emphasized, because we have already used the lower strings and higher positions to intensify the emotion. The third phrase carries the strongest emotional intensity among the three. The glissando helps highlight this change in expression. Therefore, in this phrase, I slow down the glissando slightly, continuing the change of tone. At the same pitch, different finger glissando, moving from E2 on the A string to E2 on the D string, shifting from third to sixth position. However, this glissando should not be overly emphasized, since the intensity has already been conveyed through the higher pitch, the tighter rhythmic pattern, and the change of string. Otherwise, it may sound excessive. I also add a glissando in measure 147 as a lower structural tone glissando. Although it may not appear to be a typical lower structural tone glissando, since the first note E1 is written as an ornament. In Chinese music, many ornamental notes occupy a certain proportion of the duration in performance in order to emphasize the musical gesture. For this reason, I still regard this instance as a lower structural tone glissando. Immediately following this is the same pitch, different finger glissando, from E1 to E1. This time, only the fingering changes, from the second finger to the first finger, which allows the most natural sliding effect. This glissando can be emphasized since it occurs on the G string, which gives the phrase a richer emotional character. This section is a very typical instance of recognizing where to put glissandi and organizing them. These examples clarifies how glissando should be used in Chinese traditional music. They should never be the same. It can be either subtle or emphasized. It can be either slow or fast. It depends on what kind of Chinese opera, folk songs, or Chinese instrument the music is imitating. It highlights the unique qualities of different traditional Chinese instruments and simultaneously reflects the tonal diversity inherent in the Chinese language. Now let's have a 5 minutes brief intermission. And after that, I'm going to play Ode to Guangling first, and then the ambush. Sorry for changing the order. Thank you. See you in 5 minutes. I'd like to thank to my professor and committee, thank for their guidance and time on my program, and especially Professor